Throughout the entire south of the American continent, a hardworking, fertile, and proud people witnessed a unique political phenomenon in Hispanic America. A movement with Union, nationalist, popular, and Catholic roots rose to power to challenge both communist Marxism and capitalist liberalism. The leader of this movement was General Juan Domingo Perón, a controversial man who understood the Argentine identity like few others and penetrated its collective imagination, transcending the political. Pragmatic, chameleon-like, and power-hungry, with a strong emphasis on social justice, and under the banner of putting the Argentine nation above any ideology, Perón brought together conservatives, leftists, rightists, socialists, Democrats, and liberals. And at some point he also had to confront all of them, further harassed by international powers. For some, Perón was the beginning of the decline of the southern nation. For others, the happiest years of Argentina were and will always be Peronist. There are many paradoxes surrounding this man who tried out an unprecedented style of government for America. Why do we say that it is a unique political phenomenon, impossible to pigeonhole under traditional categories? Join us until the end of this fascinating story. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below you can also find a link to the Patreon where any collaboration is more than welcome. Without anything else to add, let's get started. Juan Domingo Perón was born in a small town in the province of Buenos Aires on October 8, 1895. His mother, Juana Salvadora Sosa, was an Argentine of indigenous descent from the Tehuelche Aboriginal people, also formerly known as Patagonians. His father, Tomás Perón, on the other hand, was an Argentine whose ancestry traced back to Italian, British, and French grandparents, Perón's great-grandparents. From a young age, Perón experienced the rural lifestyle of his father, a farmer and rancher. He would later say, "I am one of those who learned to ride a horse before learning to walk." After a youth spent between the countryside and his grandmother's house in the heart of Buenos Aires, Perón decided to enter the military school in 1911, and more than 2 years later he graduated as a second lieutenant of infantry weapons, joining the Argentine armed forces from a very young age. These were times of change for the country after almost 40 years of the so-called conservative republic. In Argentina, in 1916, the first election by universal and secret mail vote took place, and the Radical Civic Union Party comes to the presidency for the first time under the leadership of Hipólito Yrigoyen. In the formative years of Perón, Argentina had more than 50 years of relative institutional continuity. In the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, with a generous people fond of work and culture and a center of much European immigration. In 1917 and 1919, Perón as a military man must participate in the government's repression against striking worker groups. His position was that the armed forces should not occupy internal security functions, let alone repress workers. Perón was very athletic during these years, practicing boxing, athletics, and fencing, a discipline where he began to teach at the non-commissioned officers' school, where he stands out as a troop instructor, and above all for the good relationship he develops with many cadets. He also drafts texts of various kinds that are printed as study material for the military academy. Juan Perón was a constant reader and writer throughout his life. Unlike many rulers, Perón left a wide written work of history, politics, and military art. Later as president, he was perhaps the only head of state in the 20th century to organize a National Philosophy Congress and present a conference at that Congress of his own authorship. By 1926, Perón entered the Superior War School, and 3 years later, at the age of 34, he graduated as an officer of the Argentine General Staff. After several years dedicated to military service, in 1929, Perón marries Aurelia Tizón, with whom he forms a couple for several years, until in 1938 his wife Tizón dies of uterine cancer. But this would not be his only wife to depart from the world prematurely. But we will return to this later. Returning to 1930 at 35 years old, Juan Domingo Perón dedicates himself to teaching military history at the Superior War Institute, where he continues to expand his circle of military friends. After decades of stability and prosperity in Argentina, in 1930 Hipólito Yrigoyen is overthrown in his second presidential term, and a conservative and corporatist civic-military regime is established. This opened a period self-named as the Neoconservative Restoration, which his opponents later called the infamous Decade. This stage would last from 1930 to 1943 and would be sustained with elections of dubious legitimacy. This is also a period of great industrialization and quantitative growth of the Argentine working class. Juan Perón participates marginally in the 1930 coup within a military faction called Legalist Nationalist, which sought to counterbalance the other faction of the new regime called Elitist Conservative. The nationalist legalist group Perón belonged to was later dissolved by the same military regime they initially supported. But Perón keeps working and advancing in the military. At the beginning of 1939, he is sent to Europe as a military attaché to continue his training and to study the war that was about to reach Europe. He visits Italy, Spain, Germany, and the Soviet Union. What Perón saw in the European nationalisms of that time, which distanced themselves from both communism and liberalism, would mark his thinking and Peronism as a movement for life. In a letter, Perón describes fascism as a great contemporary spiritual movement, a logical reaction to a century of communizing materialism. As the world underwent revolutionary changes, Argentina kept pace. There were not a few military men who believed that the galloping industrialization that Argentina was experiencing required changes in politics and the economy. While there was a growing middle class, there was also a growing proletarian class living under very precarious conditions. Opponents to the government of the infamous Decade argued that it refused to attend to the growing labor masses of Argentines. Around Perón and other military officers, a group of officers dissatisfied with the current government and eager for change and power began to gather. These officers formed the Military Lodge Group of United, presumably Group of United Officers. Finally, in June of 1943, the so-called Revolution of 43 occurs, a coup d'etat that ended the so-called infamous Decade and established a new military regime. Perón and his group of officers would have a significant participation in the planning and execution of this coup, as well as in the newly inaugurated military government. Due to his level of influence, Perón could have occupied any ministry or secretary of vital importance, but he chooses the National Department of Labor, an almost non-existent inoperative body, and a faithful reflection of the little attention that Argentine conservative governments gave to labor and worker issues. This was Perón's first government position in his life, and the dizzying activity of the young leader would turn this insignificant department into a first major political action platform. Argentine unions had long been demanding unfulfilled labor reforms, and until then had played a minor role within the government and national politics, but this reality was about to change. Perón convinces the leaders of the military government of the need to raise the living conditions of the working classes and incorporate them into national plans, rather than letting these labor flags be taken into the hands of the left. Perón outlines the convenient alliance between workers, peasants, and businessmen around common goals. Perón, from the Department of Labor, begins a lively agenda with union leaders. By October of 1943, the government creates the Secretariat of Labor and Welfare, and Perón expands his powers when he is appointed as its head. In this secretariat, Perón begins to approach worker groups in a way that no ruler had done before. He skillfully establishes alliances with union leaders of all ideologies. From the Ministry of Labor, Perón begins to approve labor reforms and decree laws that had historically been demanded by the labor movement. Perón takes projects from socialist legislators and with slight adjustments gets them approved by a nationalist military government. Perón achieves measures such as the generalized compensation of workers, decrees paid vacations and bonuses, achieves retirement laws for all unions, regulates the 8-hour workday, promotes for the first time collective negotiations between workers and employers, creates labor courts, and approves the Statute of the Peon, the first labor legislation that typified the rights of the agricultural worker. Many of these labor measures were part of the historical program of Argentine unionism. Only they were being led by a nationalist military officer who persecuted socialists and communists. Workers begin to recognize Perón as the leader of a revolution that was beginning. Perón was a charismatic, witty, and eloquent man, but he was also quite cautious in dealing with others. Of good stature and radiant smile, he gradually won the sympathy of many, especially the middle and lower classes of Argentine society. At the invitation of a unionist, Perón begins to personally attend worker assemblies, where his popularity stands out for his labor measures and reforms, which are presented by union leaders as the first worker of Argentina. What has been called the Peronist Revolution was underway. But these labor measures also begin to earn Perón enemies among landowning and business groups who accused him of being a demagogue. The left also accused him of snatching victories that belonged to socialism, where the left had hegemonic unions, but still created parallel unions with better services and benefits as they were directly protected by the state. Meanwhile, the United States regards the Argentine government with deep mistrust. Since the governments of the infamous decade, Argentina had refused to allow Latin American nations to back the United States in World War II as a bloc. Argentina believed that neutrality was the way to go. In turn, Argentina was one of the few Latin American countries that still maintained closer ties with English and European powers than with the American power. Argentina's neutrality in the war would cost it increasing pressure and retaliation, to such an extent that in the early 40s the United States froze Argentine reserves in its banks, canceled Argentine export permits for steel, wood, and chemical products, and kept Argentina isolated from the international bodies that were emerging at the end of the war. This hostility towards Argentina would continue in the early years of Perón as president, but we will talk more about that later. Returning to the year 1944, General Ramirez, who was the acting president of the government, is displaced by General Farrell, who was part of the same military regime but much closer to Perón. According to some historians, Perón and Farrell sought to form within the military government a popular nationalist pole, which confronted another more conservative military sector of the government called elitist nationalist. When Farrell becomes president, he appoints Perón as Minister of War and Vice President of the nation. It was a new pinnacle moment for our protagonist. He was now the true main figure of the Argentine government, despite not being president, and the country began to polarize around his figure. Among Perón and his close associates, the idea was raised that in not too much time, the young military and political figure would have the potential to be president. In February of 1945, as vice president of the nation, Perón makes a secret trip to the United States to negotiate an end to the blockade on Argentina and recognition of the Argentine government in exchange for Argentina declaring war on Germany and Japan in alliance with the United States, a matter that President Farrell ends up decreeing in March 1945, not without opposition from a large part of the military establishment. Simultaneously, the government is making all the preparations to call for presidential elections that year with a clear favorite candidate. However, the vigorous alliance that was advancing between the unions and the young military men led by Perón had its detractors, internal sectors of the same government, the United States, and organized landowners. By 1945, the new American ambassador arrives in Argentina. Sprolbraven, well known for his interventionist policy in Latin America. The ambassador begins to operate forcefully within Argentina to finance and articulate the opposition against Perón. After massive mobilizations against and in favor of Peronist labor policies, amidst pressures and internal squabbles, a group of high-ranking army officials, led by General Eduardo Ábalos and colluding with the opposition, forced Perón to resign his positions on October 8, 1945. In addition, on October 11th, the United States asked Great Britain to stop buying Argentine goods to precipitate the fall of the government. General Ábalos assumes as the new war minister and becomes the new strongman of the government. On October 12th, Perón is arrested by the military and transferred to Martín Garcia Island and then to the military hospital where they keep him imprisoned. For many opponents, Perón was already a political corpse. The political and even civil confrontations between Peronists and anti-Peronists in this scenario were intensifying in Buenos Aires. It seemed like the defeat of the man who was changing politics in Argentina. But these events, rather, were about to take a turn in the political history of the southern nation. On October 17, 1945, hundreds of thousands of protesters, initially mobilized by a handful of union and guild leaders, especially from the outskirts of the city, marched towards the heart of Buenos Aires and occupied the center of the capital, concentrated in the famous Plaza de Mayo, protesting and demanding the release of Colonel Perón. The crowd was huge, it was a nervous situation, and confusion was spreading. General Ábalos remains passive and refuses to mobilize troops against the protesters. After pressure from sectors close to Perón, the Minister of War was forced to meet with Perón and negotiate the conditions for his release. It ends up being impactful that Perón would calm the mass of protesters and ask them to withdraw peacefully. Likewise, Perón could not hold new positions in the current administration, but in exchange, the government cabinet had to resign in its entirety and had to call new elections for the first months of the following year. In this way, in the middle of the night, Perón appears from the balcony of the presidential house with his arms raised. With a messianic aura, he greets the large mass of protesters. It was an almost mythical scene in which he delivers a speech that would seal what would later be remembered as Loyalty Day by the Peronist government. True patriots. Remember workers. Unite. Be more brothers than ever today, on the brotherhood of those who work. Rise up in this beautiful homeland, the unity of all Argentines. Perón had imposed himself against the reaction and was consolidating himself as a first-rate national figure. With this historic mass act, Peronism was born as we were going to know it. A couple of years before this canon event, Perón meets a young 24-year-old actress who, in his own words, was of a fragile appearance but with a resolute voice. With long blonde hair falling down her back, her eyes lit up as if by fever. End quote. The name of this woman was Eva Duarte, and she would soon start a relationship with Perón. 2 years later, just 6 days after Perón's release, following the massive demonstration, Perón marries Eva Duarte, now known as Evita Perón, who would become a key figure not only in Peronism but in Argentine popular culture. We dedicate a fascinating documentary about her life on this channel that we encourage you to watch. Perón's release from jail came with the personal resolution, and that of his collaborators, to aspire to the presidency of the Argentine Republic. Perón soon starts his presidential campaign. The Peronist unions create the Labor Party to launch Perón's candidacy, along with a faction of the Radical Civic Union and the Independent Party, while Juan Perón organizes workers, businessmen, military leaders, and other sectors that he was able to capitalize on thanks to the Secretary of Labor. The opposition to Perón is organized around the so-called Democratic Union, which grouped socialists, communists, Democrats, conservatives, and the so-called radicals, an Argentine political group with centrist and liberal features. In turn, the opposition was actively supported by the United States Embassy and by prominent landowners and business sectors that had been harmed by Perón's labor reforms. The intensity of this campaign polarizes and fractures Argentine society. Ambassador Braden organizes the opposition leaders, delivers money, and orders publications against Perón. In response, the Peronists consecrate the campaign slogan Braden or Perón. Finally, in February of 1946 in Argentina, Juan Domingo Perón won the presidential elections, a candidate who had achieved popular support like very few until then, and who was viewed with suspicion by groups of high American politics and finance. This, moreover, when the Anglo-Saxon nation was just consolidating itself as the great leading power of the post-war world. But he wins with two-thirds of the electorate, unlike Perón, who wins with two-thirds of the electorate. Unlike recognized as clean elections by all the losing sides. In this whirlwind of intrigues and hopes begins the first magistracy of Juan Domingo Perón as president of the nation for the period 1946 and 1952. The doctrine that would guide Perón's thought and government would be that of justicialism, a labor nationalism of Catholic roots that sought, quote, a socially just, economically free, and politically sovereign Argentina, end quote. Under the Peronist vision, a true enlargement of the Argentine nation was only possible also with the redemption of the workers and the popular classes. Peronism incorporated elements from any current of thought that it considered beneficial to the Argentine nation. It took influences from both Catholic conservatism and socialism, trade unionism, and mass politics. Both communism and capitalist liberalism were equally rejected. In foreign policy, this would give rise to the doctrine of the third position, which we will mention again later. In his message to Congress in 1952 about justicialism, Perón says, on one hand, capitalist individualism subjected nations to the omnipotent, cold, and selfish will of money. On the other hand, communist collectivism subjected nations to the crushing and totalitarian power of the state. That's why we decided to create the new foundations of a third position that would allow us to offer our people another path that would not lead them to exploitation and misery, end quote. Now this justicialist vision had to descend from the abstract heights of philosophy to the concrete action of government, thus beginning Perón's presidential work. Under a discourse of economic sovereignty and social justice, Perón announces the so-called First Five-Year Plan in 1947. This plan focused on a series of policies and infrastructure works to boost the industrialization of Argentina with heavy and light industry in areas such as steel, manufacturing, creation of electric power, petrochemical, aviation, and other sectors. Under Perón's plan, Argentina became a Latin American pioneer in developing nuclear and hydroelectric energy as part of an energy independence policy. Likewise, the five-year plan focused on strengthening and modernizing the agricultural sector, which saw an increase in its productivity during these years, especially wheat planting. Finally, the five-year plan focused on the nationalization of strategic sectors of the economy, such as the banking sector, railways, foreign trade, and the oil and hydrocarbon sector. This nationalization policy, it should be noted, came from governments prior to Perón's. The state assumes greater responsibility in the direction of the economy under Juan Perón. But this is not an invention of Perón, but rather a process that came from the 30s, which, like with Perón, responded not only to an economic criterion, but to geopolitical and internal security criteria. Similarly, Perón considers the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to be organs of American economic colonialism, so he refuses for Argentina to be part of them, managing through bilateral agreements. By 1952, the Peronist government decides to completely pay off the foreign debt. Argentina went from being a debtor country of $12.5 billion to a creditor country of more than $5 billion. How can it be explained that in a country where everything is yet to be done, there are 800,000 people who cannot work? It's not the government's obligation to create that. When the time came, we launched the first 5-year plan that consisted of 76,000 works. Undoubtedly, by launching those 76,000 works, everything was set in motion. The country broke the inertia. The first result was that the 800,000 unemployed found work within 2-3 months. When the 800,000 unemployed were employed, wages rose on their own, because when there is full employment, there is no need to boost wages. They rise on their own. Of course, when wages rose, the purchasing power of the masses, which is the real consumption, multiplied several times. As consumption multiplied and increased, this immediately invigorated trade, which geared up to meet the demand of this multiplied consumption. This demanded the necessary transformation from the industry for distribution through trade. As a result, the industry got underway and everyone started thinking about industrial development. The great complement to the 5-year plan was in social policy, in improving the standard of living through redistribution programs and policies and works, for expanding housing, health, and education. President Perón, primarily using the Ministry of Labor and the Eva Perón Foundation, is dedicated to the construction of an extensive welfare state in Argentina. Similarly, in an unprecedented way, the popular classes are actively incorporated into public affairs through various mechanisms at the local and regional level, also seeking to expand the Argentine identity to all sectors. This social policy is what differentiates the state directionism of Peronism from the directionism of the conservative governments of the years. The state acts this time systematically in the social field and of the popular classes and seeks to incorporate them into internal markets that stimulate production and consumption. Similarly, all the labor reforms achieved by Perón during his time in the Labor Secretariat are ratified and expanded. Retirements are extended to professionals, independent workers, and indirect labor benefits are granted, such as housing plans for workers, free holiday colonies for workers, distribution of school clothing and texts, among others. Between 1945 and 1948, the real wages of public employees had a rise of 35%, and those of industrial workers rose by an average of 50%. In the same period, consumption in both the public and private sectors rose by around 20%. However, the expansive policy of stimulating demand through social spending and loans from the central bank led to an increase in inflation to more than 30% annually by the end of Perón's first government. In his second term, he reduced inflation to a single digit, but other economic issues remained. In terms of health from this social policy, Peronism moved towards a unified preventive, curative, and social assistance system, inaugurating about 500 medical establishments. During Perón's presidency, infant mortality and diseases such as tuberculosis, yellow fever, syphilis, and malaria were substantially reduced. On the other hand, there was a significant degree of promotion and development of sport at all levels, especially in neighborhoods for youth. In terms of energy, in 6 years, oil production in Argentina increased by 50%. However, self-sufficiency was an unviable goal, so in his second government, Perón made a deal with Standard Oil, a vast mixed exploitation program in the south of Argentina. In turn, the installed hydroelectric power in Argentina multiplied by 8 between 1945 and 1952. Between the first and second 5-year plan, the construction of 86 hydroelectric plants and 11 thermal plants began. There is also a broad program for the irrigation of agricultural lands with the construction of 29 reservoirs, 59 dams, and other works. After the overthrow of Perón, many of the works that had started a few years ago were discontinued. Under the discourse of social justice in education, Perón's government promotes middle and lower strata, technical education, and secondary education. There was also a policy of bringing the university closer to the popular sectors. University classrooms began to receive more children of workers. 14 new universities were created during his first government, including the National Workers' University. By 1949, Perón decreed the total free of charge for public university education and established the first scholarship system for low-income students. On the other hand, in the public and private educational system, with the approval of the government, there is a wide presence of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Catechism in the formation of young people. Alongside all of this, the government introduces Peronist propaganda wherever it can in primary and secondary education. Perón also creates what would become the main organization in Argentina, dedicated to scientific and technological research. When Mingo Perón enjoyed extraordinary popular support and displayed innovative rhetorical and propagandistic methods with massive acts that were almost rituals, he spared no expense, just like Mussolini, to get his image, his doctrine, his cause to every corner of Argentina. Under his pragmatism, Perón manages to bring together left, center, and right groups around his figure, and when asked about the political landscape of Argentina, Perón would say, "Look, there's 30% of radicals, what you understand as liberals, 30% of conservatives, and another of socialists." The journalist interrupts him and says, "But General, where are the Peronists?" To which Perón responds, "Oh no, everyone is a Peronist." The truth is that between the 40s and 50s, Argentina was living the Peronist revolution. These were vigorous and conflicting times, while the economy improved for some and worsened for others. By his side as First Lady was Mrs. Maria Eva Duarte de Perón, companion of Evita, the partner of the leader. Always serene with a friendly face and dressed to the nines, Eva Perón would have a stellar participation. She was not just a smiling face, but a woman who knew how to relate, led groups, gave speeches, met with union leaders, and lobbied with whoever she could for the good of Argentina. The presence of the female figure is not Argentina. The presence of the female figure is not just symbolic in the Peronist government, but it materializes in facts. By 1947, a historic law was passed that granted women the right to vote and be voted for government positions. Peronist nationalism distanced itself from other more conservative Argentine nationalisms. In the 50s, no country had as many women in Congress as Argentina. Legal equality in marriage and parental authority is also introduced. Foreign policy was so important to Perón to the point of saying that the real policy was foreign policy. In this way, in foreign affairs, Peronism developed the international doctrine of the third position, which argued that Argentina in the Cold War should not align with either the United States or the Soviet Union, but should act according to what best suited its national interest and world peace. Argentina seeks to be friends with both powers, although in practice, Peronist pragmatism and external circumstances end up bringing Perón closer to the United States and the Western Bloc. Peronism signs numerous integration agreements with Latin American countries as part of its foreign policy in order to seek greater autonomy from North American hegemony. We must remember that when Perón arrives at the Casa Rosada, the American-Argentine blockade policy that had started in the previous government was largely maintained. However, economic and political reality forced Perón to seek an understanding with the United States and achieve Argentina's reintegration into international bodies that gained much global prominence after approaches and negotiations for 1946. The United States decides to release the gold and Argentine funds blocked since 1944 in exchange to Americans. Also, as part of the negotiations, the American Congress. Also, as part of the negotiations, the Argentine Congress ratifies its adherence to the Chapultepec Act. a document that served as a precedent to the Organization of American States and the current inter-American system where no country has more influence than the United States. However, Argentina continued to act sovereignly in ways that North America considered as a provocation. For example, when there was a lot of hunger in Spain after the World War and the Castilian country's economy was blocked by the United States and the Soviets, from 1947, Argentina sent hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat and other food to Spain, food that would be paid for in the future and at very low interest. Eva during the delivery of the first large batch of food, in the wheat delivery of the first large batch of food. In the wheat that was lovingly cultivated by the shirtless of my people, I bring you the message of love, solidarity, and brotherhood, and the affectionate embrace from one great people to another great people. Know, Spanish workers, that as long as there is a spike in our wheat fields, it will be shared with you with our solidarity and expression of peace, of Christianity, and of social justice. Therefore, despite the oppressive powers, the justicialist government of General Perón has set a slogan. In Spain, there will be no home without bread, no child without milk. My people are humble and good as you are, but proud and haughty as you also are. Always keep in mind that only solidarity among the humble of the powerful. The United States considers this as an affront to its power. The United States considers this as an affront to its country. Despite the rapprochement between Argentina and the United States, the nationalist policies and anti-imperialist discourse of Peronism maintained tensions with the North, and in 1948 the United States decides to ban the purchase of meats, grains, and other Argentine products in European markets that to the Argentine economy, depriving it of several of its main buyers. Perón also resumes in 1947 with the endorsement of Washington the relations of Argentina with the Soviet Union, suspended since 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. Perón also begins to sell grains in large quantities to the Soviet bloc. In the midst of these dizzying times, the political dynamics within Argentina would be marked by a strong conflict between Peronists and anti-Peronists, a polarization that still exists today. From the beginning, Perón's government was marked by conspiracies against him. During his years, Perón's government makes arrests and imprisonments and closes and expropriates media outlets. On his part, he closes and expropriates media outlets. On the other hand, from the anti-Peronism, there was the creation of armed civilian commands that carried out various attacks. There were coup attempts like the one carried out in 1951, which failed in a short time. There were bomb attacks at union meetings, like the one at Plaza de Mayo in 1953, and new coup attempts that involved the bombing and strafing of demonstrators in 1955, an action that would bring more than 300 deaths, and to which we will return later. Controversial was also during Perón's presidency the entry into Argentina of many ex-members of the National Socialist regime. After his overthrow, like the United States and the Soviet Union, Argentina sought to capture part of the human talent of the Reich. In contrast, and as a sign of the chameleon-like policy of Peronism, the Argentine government is also the first in Latin America to recognize and establish relations with the State of Israel in 1949. And in Argentina, the Peronist government was very close to the Jewish community. At the end of Perón's first presidential term, economic problems arise. Drastic changes in management and economic structure, sanctions in the United States, and two severe droughts lead to sanctions in the United States, and two severe droughts lead to quinquenal. Beyond these problems, new presidential elections are held in Argentina in 1951, and Juan Domingo Perón comfortably wins again with more than two-thirds of the electorate. He assumes a new term as President of the Republic that formally begins in June of 1952. But just a month after the start of the new term, Peronism would take a turn with features of a Greek tragedy when unexpectedly the driver's wife, one of the greatest sources of inspiration for the Peronist movement, fell ill and died suddenly. Evita's death would be a great personal blow for Perón and a morale blow for his followers. But the work of Peronism had to continue. As we said, in the face of economic problems, Perón changes his economic policy, giving greater weight to the promotion of foreign investment, and also carries out fiscal austerity measures. At this stage, important multinationals inaugurate steel mills, assembly plants, and new oil operations. By 1953, the inflationary process is brought under control, and the economy begins to grow rapidly again from the beginning of 1955. Meanwhile, the anti-Peronist opposition starts attracting some sectors that previously backed exploiting resentment between social classes. A notable aspect is the exploitation of resentment between social classes. A notable aspect of his second term is that although Peronism was intimately linked with the Catholic Church from its beginnings, by 1954 a harsh confrontation between the two groups begins. This was due to the ecclesiastical hierarchy making various criticisms of Perón's government in an environment of growing tension in Argentina. As the conflict escalates, Perón bans the processions in Argentina. Perón bans religious demonstrations in public places and expels 2 bishops from the country. The church begins to accuse him of being a tyrant. The entire Argentine population was Christian and socially conservative. The Argentine population, which was Christian and socially conservative. The conflicts and conspiracies against Perón did not stop, and a new event marks tragedy to the Peronist government. With his supporters gathered in the Plaza de Mayo on June 16, 1955, in the distance you can hear the sound of jets that, in a matter of seconds, drop explosives on the crowd in the center of Buenos Aires. It was an attempted coup by the naval aviation and sectors of the Air Force and infantry. The military also had the support of socialist, radical, and conservative groups and sectors of the church. The bombing and attacks on the square left more than 300 Argentines dead. The attacks continue for 18 hours, but the rebels do not achieve their goal and have to seek asylum in Uruguay. The atmosphere was of an imminent civil war, and Perón calls for a dialogue with all sectors to avoid a greater conflict. Beyond some, it was broken, and there was a firm resolution from internal and external groups to get rid of Perón however possible. After 2 months of this coup attempt, there is a new military uprising on September 16th. General Eduardo Leonardi, General Pedro Aramburu, and Admiral Isaac Rojas, nationalist Catholics, organized the so-called Liberating Revolution from a barracks in Córdoba. Perón, fearing a war for Argentina, refuses control of the country. Juan Domingo Perón takes control of the country. Juan Domingo Perón boards a ship provided by Paraguayan President Alfredo Stroessner and goes upstream of the Paraná, escaping from his enemies. A new stage was beginning for the country, but the man who had been overthrown had marked the Argentine collective imagination in a way that persists to this day and would soon have his return. This is how we get to 1955 on September 16th, when some generals also rise up in front of some troop sectors. We could have perfectly crushed that. I remember that in a meeting I had with my direct advisors and the Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic, General Sosa Molina, who was the military secretary of the presidency, told me, "If I were Perón, I would fight." I replied, "If I were Sosa Molina, I would also fight." But on my shoulders weighed a serious responsibility that I had to defend at that moment with all my authority. So I decided not to do anything. I thought that in the nation there is nothing superior to the nation itself. And faced with the possible violent depredation of all that we had been doing for 9 years, it was preferable for me to give in. I did not want to lead the Republic into a civil war or a bloody struggle. Consequently, what remained to be done was simply to let them do what they wanted. If justicialism was right, it would return. If it wasn't right, maybe it was better that it didn't return. Have passed. Almost 13 years since that moment. Undoubtedly, time has made me change my mind. Today, I believe I made a serious mistake. I should have decreed mobilization. Start by shooting all the rebel generals and all the chiefs and officers who were in treason and violently dominate that revolution as they violently wanted to throw us out of power. If at this moment I had to do it, I would do it. Because now I know what I didn't know then, that these people came to do the most serious damage that could have been done to the country. The new military regime that overthrows Perón aims to completely neutralize Peronism. Peronist movements are outlawed and censored from politics. Perón is degraded from the army, accused of political crimes, and political parties are generally banned. Meanwhile, Perón began his pilgrimage in exile. From Paraguay, he goes to Venezuela, where President Marcos Pérez Jiménez protects him until he is also overthrown. From there, Perón goes to Panama, where he meets the singer Maristela Martinez, alias Isabel, who would become his third wife and future political partner. After Panama, Perón must go to Spain, where he is protected by General Francisco Franco. In 1961, General Francisco Franco, in 1961 and in the Catholic Church, Perón remained actively engaged in politics. In Argentina, there was a solid Peronist movement, and Perón maintains close contact with his followers. In response to the prohibition of Peronism, many Peronists organized themselves into clandestine groups that carry out violent actions, such as sabotage of public offices or detonation of bombs on railway tracks. From there would emerge armed Peronist organizations, guerrillas, and of Marxist or socialist tendency, such as the case of Montoneros, and largely made up of young people. After a failed attempt to return to Argentina, Perón sends his wife in 1965 to meet with political dissidents to advance in the policy of confrontation with the Argentine government and electoral boycotts. In his exile, Perón gets closer to the so-called revolutionary Peronism than to orthodox Peronism, as the Peronist left was the most opposed at that time to the military regime that ruled in Argentina. His speech in exile was that Argentina should move towards a national socialism that was neither Marxist nor capitalist. Perón openly supports the armed struggle of revolutionary Peronism and Montoneros. Argentina would reject these groups. Within Peronism, Argentina would reject these groups. Within Peronism, an intense conflict was growing between the leftist groups of Peronism and the so-called Peronist orthodoxy, which was more conservative, military, and right-wing. In his exile in Spain, Perón has an enigmatic character named José López Rega as his private secretary. López Rega was an Argentine politician and writer, a great strategist for behind-the-scenes politics, and a member of the anti-communist Italian Amazonian lodge called Propaganda Do, where he was also allegedly a fan of esotericism. López Rega would gain a strong influence in the last years of Peronism. Amid much internal conflict, the Argentine military regime sees that it will not be able to sustain itself for long, so it begins to organize a peaceful exit from power. Perón begins a process of reconciliation with radical politicians and other opposing tendencies that further weaken the military regime. The government calls general elections for 1973, and in this process of reopening an already elderly Juan Domingo Perón manages to return to his native Argentina after almost 20 years of exile. He is received by hopeful multitudes of a new one who runs for president. So he goes into temporary exile and in his place nominates a man of his trust, the left-wing Peronist, Héctor Campera. Argentine society votes and shows its support for Perón, electing Campera as the new president of the country. Between Perón's old age and Argentina's internal problems and Peronism, the situation that Perón faces upon his return quickly goes from hope to concern and tragedy. When Perón returns to Argentina on June 20th, 1953, a public rally is held where the Seiza massacre occurs, a shootout between Peronist groups. Camouflaged snipers, presumably from the orthodoxy or the right wing of original Peronism, shoot to kill the young socialist sectors associated with Montoneros, causing confrontations and 13 deaths. The union Perón had achieved between left-wing and orthodox Peronism was broken. In this scenario, Perón ends up leaning towards orthodoxy and moves away from the left again. On his part, Hector Campera, 2 months after taking office as president, resigns to call new elections in which Perón could be a candidate. Perón forges a political coalition and becomes the first Argentine to be elected 3 times to the presidency of the Republic. He leads a new presidential term with his wife Maria Estela Martinez, a new presidential term with his wife Maria Estela Martinez as the president of Argentina on October 12th of 1000, president of Argentina on October 12th of 1973. The situation was not simple. Military dictatorships allied with the U.S. held power in 5 South American nations, while the world grappled with the major oil shock of 1973. The opposition unites leftists, liberals, and conservatives on one side, and guerrillas and armed commandos on the other. As the 70s matured in Argentina, political conflicts were still being settled through death squads. The Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo and other guerrilla organizations carry out attacks against the army, shootings, and guerrilla organizations carry out attacks against the army, shootings, and José López Rega, Minister of Social Welfare of Perón's government, coordinates the formation of the famous Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, what would be called the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. This group pursues and ends the lives of more than 600 left-wing militants, both Peronists and non-Peronists. All this with the alleged consent of Perón. Despite Perón's health being complicated, the president maintains a schedule full of meetings and activities. His economic policy in this third period was marked by the so-called Social Pact, which aimed at inflation and maintaining economic growth. Internationally, Perón maintains inflation and economic growth. Internationally, Perón maintains non-alignment with the 2 major powers and seeks to consolidate South American cooperation organizations that do not depend on the United States. Also during this period, with special promotion from López Rega, there was a significant promotion of birth rates in Argentina in response to the growing anti-natalist trends that were becoming popular worldwide. At a massive demonstration in 1974 in Plaza de Mayo, Perón is questioned by the revolutionary left-wing Peronism with the chant, "What's happening, General?" That the popular government is full of guerrillas, General Perón. The popular government is full of guerrillas. The march, in turn, in 6 Argentine provinces as a demonstration of the internal conflict of Peronism. The governors who belonged to revolutionary Peronism were overthrown by elements of orthodox Peronism with the endorsement of Perón. But all this situation was about to take an irreversible turn. On June 12th, Perón spoke at a public event without his followers knowing that it would be the last time they would see him. Already aware of his deteriorating health, he warns the protesters that difficult times were coming and ends his speech by saying, "No. I deeply appreciate that you have come to this historic Plaza de Mayo. I carry in my ears the most wonderful music, which for me is the word of the Argentine people. On June 28th, Perón suffers several myocardial infarctions, and Isabel is secretly sworn in as the new president of Argentina. After a day at the presidential residence of Quinta de Olivos, Juan Domingo Perón dies on July 1st of 1974 at 1:15 in the afternoon at the age of 78. That man who deeply touched the Argentine imagination departed forever from the earthly world. Perón's body was transported to the Buenos Aires Cathedral for his funeral mass. Then the body, dressed in military attire, was taken to the National Congress Palace, where it lay in state for 46 hours. More than 130,000 people came to say goodbye to Perón. Then on July 4th, in the pouring rain, the funeral procession began. 1 million people accompanied him along 16 kilometers. When the funeral procession reached its destination 2.5 hours later, Perón was bid farewell with a 21-gun salute and 3 days of mourning. Isabel Perón succeeded her husband in the presidency and faced serious problems, including confrontations between left-wing guerrilla groups and right-wing paramilitary groups. The escalating violent struggle and lack of leadership serve as a pretext to abruptly end Isabel Perón's presidential term on March 24, 1976, when, in a coup supported by the United States, a military junta led by General Jorge Rafael Videla takes control of political power and establishes the process called national reorganization, marking the beginning of a new era for Argentina. Under this new regime, political parties are banned and a state of war is assumed from the state against the armed groups. There are many reflections and interpretations that can be made about this character and his historical times, about which there is undoubtedly much left to tell. Perón forever marks Argentina and Latin America with actions impossible to pigeonhole into traditional categories: national, union, and popular, but also nationalist and Catholic, personalist, and autocrat, but also incorporates like no one else the popular classes into public affairs. This was the life of Juan Domingo Perón, a life full of aspirations and conflicts. His figure transcends politics to become a cultural phenomenon that persists to this day as part of Argentine identity. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget that it is very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and above all, that you collaborate with us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you all, and God bless you.